They burned his barn over a debt, and the men who struck the match believed fire erased witnesses. But out on the frontier, old debts had longer memories than smoke. Before we continue, remember this: some judgments do not come wearing a badge. Some rise with the dust. At first light, Elias Boone stood in the ashes where his horse barn had been, boots blackened with soot, the dawn wind carrying the bitter smell of charred pine and wet earth. What remained was silence, the kind that settles after a wrong too large for words. His ranch sat 20 miles from Red Mesa, where the prairie rolled flat and empty until the horizon shimmered like hammered copper. Nothing moved but a weathered gate tapping in the wind and one half-burned lantern rocking from a post. Folks in town said Elias should have paid Silas Crow what he owed. $23.70. They whispered, as if numbers could explain cruelty. But debt had been only the excuse. Silas wanted the water rights under Boone land, and every man in Bitter Creek knew it. They had watched the night before from saloon windows while flames climbed the dark, and no one stepped outside. That morning Elias bent in the ash and found something untouched by fire, a Comanche arrow wrapped with faded red leather. He turned it slowly in his calloused hand, and for the first time his eyes changed. Not anger, recognition. Across the road, old Mrs. Pritchard stood with a shawl over her shoulders and said, "You gonna ride to the sheriff?" Elias slid the arrow into his coat and answered, "Some reckonings ride faster than law." By noon Silas Crow was laughing in front of the mercantile, boots on a barrel, telling men Boone would be gone by winter. "A poor rancher with no cattle ain't worth defending," he said. Yet before sundown, a boy running telegraph errands swore he saw riders far west beyond Red Mesa, little specks moving through the heat shimmer. No one believed him. Not then. That night Elias sat beside a cold fire pit outside his cabin, listening to coyotes call from dry ravines. Moonlight silvered the empty corral. He touched the arrow again and remembered another boy long ago beside a river crossing swollen. With spring melt, remembered dark eyes watching him choose mercy over fear. Memory moved over him like old thunder. In town, Silas drank and boasted louder. He said no tribe would ride for a white rancher. He said the frontier had changed. He said old alliances were dust. But before dawn on the second day, 3 riders came hard into Bitter Creek from the west, horses lathered, faces pale beneath trail dust. They said they counted not 10 riders, not 50, but columns moving silent along the flats beyond Red Mesa. No war cries, no torches, just dust rising in long red walls under the morning sun. Even then Silas mocked them. "Scouts," he said, "nothing more." But old Mrs. Pritchard crossed herself and whispered something older than fear. On the third sunrise, before church bells, before store doors opened, the earth itself seemed to hum. Folks stepped onto porches and looked west. What they first took for storm clouds was moving. Elias Boone stood alone at the edge of town, coats stirring in the wind, watching the horizon darken with riders. And in that moment Bitter Creek began to understand the fire had not ended a poor rancher. It had summoned judgment. The riders did not enter Bitter Creek at a gallop. They came slow, measured, their horses stepping through morning dust as if crossing sacred ground. 500 shadows stretched long under the rising sun, and the whole town stood frozen beneath porches and awnings, listening to the soft thunder of hooves. No man among them raised a weapon. No voice shouted command. Silence held greater authority. At their front rode Dakota Red Hawk, broad-shouldered, wrapped in dark buckskin marked by age and travel, his face still as canyon stone. He stopped 20 feet from Elias Boone and looked down without speaking. Then, before the town that had pitted one man and feared another, Elias reached into his coat and held up the old arrow. Dakota nodded once, like a promise remembered. But judgment did not begin with the riders. It began with a ledger. In the mercantile, Sheriff Wallace tried to steady his hands while Silas Crow demanded the Comanche be driven off. Yet the sheriff had not slept. He had spent the night staring at a set of county records Boone once begged him to read. A land deed altered by fresh ink, interest charges written over older numbers, a debt inflated until no honest man could pay. Silas had hidden theft inside paperwork, trusting numbers more than guns. Outside, townsfolk gathered as Dakota dismounted and pressed a weathered leather bundle into Elias's hands. Inside lay a folded paper, brittle with years, carrying the old trade Mark Boone once signed after saving a stranded Comanche child near floodwaters. It was no treaty, yet older than law in its meaning. A debt of honor. Mrs. Pritchard whispered, "Good Lord!" Even those who mocked Boone now felt something shift beneath their boots. Silas Crow stepped from the mercantile porch, chin lifted, pretending courage. "This is my town," he barked. "These riders have no claim here." Dakota turned his gaze toward him, not angry, only grave. Then in slow English, heavy with old cadence, he said, "A man who steals water steals life. A man who burns shelter breaks sacred trust." The words drifted over the street like smoke. Sheriff Wallace swallowed hard and carried out the county ledger. His badge caught sunlight as he opened the book before the gathered town. Pages fluttered in the wind. Every forged sum, every added charge, every false lien on Boone land. Men who once borrowed from Silas began muttering to each other, realizing their own debts had grown the same way. What had looked like one rancher's misfortune widened into something larger. A town had been feeding a lie. Elias said little. He only stood beside Dakota while truth did the speaking. Then came the twist no one expected. Dakota did not call for punishment. He called for witness. One by one, 10 Comanche elders rode forward and formed a half-circle in the dust. Not as war council but as tribunal. Even Sheriff Wallace removed his hat. Bitter Creek had become a courtroom without walls. Silas looked suddenly smaller than the porch he stood on. Yet Elias stepped toward him and spoke so quietly only those nearest heard. "You took my barn," he said, "but greed took more from you." The wind rose through town, lifting dust around horse legs and storefront steps. Somewhere a church bell rang once. And for the first time, Bitter Creek understood the riders had not come to destroy a town. They had come to measure its soul. The town remained gathered in the street long after the tribunal circle formed, but what held them was no longer fear. It was the strange weight of unfinished history. Dakota Red Hawk lifted his hand, and one young rider stepped forward carrying a wrapped bundle of deerskin darkened by age. He placed it before Elias Boone and stepped back. No one moved. Even the horses seemed to wait. Elias knelt slowly and unfolded the bundle, and inside lay a child's beaded wrist cord, sun-faded blue and white. His breath caught so softly only Mrs. Pritchard noticed. "I remember that," she whispered, though no one had asked. The dust, the riders, the town square all seemed to fade as memory opened. 20 years earlier, spring floodwaters had torn through a canyon crossing north of Red Mesa. Elias had been younger then, driving cattle through waist-deep current when he saw a boy clinging to driftwood, swept toward rock and foam. No one else had ridden into that river. He had gone because a child was drowning. That was all. He had carried the boy to shore, wrapped him in his own coat, and stayed beside him until Comanche riders found them at dusk. They had offered silver. Elias refused it. The boy had pressed an arrow wrapped in red leather into his hand and said in halting English, "Debt runs both ways." Then they vanished into the hills, and life rolled onward as frontier life does, covering old miracles with dust. Now Dakota looked across the years and said, "I was that boy." The words moved through Bitter Creek like wind through dry grass. Silas Crow's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. For once, even pride had gone quiet. Sheriff Wallace lowered his eyes. Some truths arrived too large for interruption. Dakota stepped closer to the townsfolk and pointed to the forged ledger. "This paper claims debt in dollars," he said. "But this man," and he touched his chest, "stands in a debt older than paper." His voice carried no triumph, only gravity. Elias looked at the beaded cord in his hands and gave a faint smile worn thin by years. "I had forgotten," he said. Dakota answered, "We did not." Then another rider came forward, an elder with silver in his braid, carrying a small clay jar sealed in wax. He opened it and poured dry earth into his palm. Red mesa soil. Sacred ground. He let it fall over the forged ledger pages. Dust over falsehood. Symbol over accusation. Even those who understood none of the ritual felt its meaning. Silas Crow suddenly barked that this was theater, not law. Yet his voice cracked, because something had shifted beyond his reach. Men who once borrowed under his terms now stepped away from him on the porch. The blacksmith crossed his arms. The grocer removed his hat. Quiet judgments were multiplying. Then came a moment no one expected. Dakota turned not to Elias but to the crowd. A town that watches wrong in silence carries part of the wrong. Several faces dropped toward the dirt. Mrs. Pritchard began to cry, not from fear, from recognition. And Elias, who had lost a barn but gained back something older than property, looked west where sunlight struck the distant mesa in bronze fire. He seemed to understand the riders had not only come to settle his debt. They had come to test whether Bitter Creek could still be redeemed. And as the wind stirred the red dust over that false ledger, the first seeds of a harder judgment began to take root. By late afternoon, the tribunal had moved beneath the cottonwoods near the dry creek bed where Bitter Creek first took its name, and the sun hung low in a copper sky, throwing long shadows over riders, townsfolk, and the silent ledger lying beneath red dust. No verdict had been spoken. That unsettled everyone more than a sentence would have. Frontier men understood punishment. Waiting was harder. Dakota Red Hawk sat his horse without movement, watching the town reveal itself through small things. Who stood beside whom? Who stepped back? Who could not meet Elias Boone's eyes? In that silence, Sheriff Wallace did something no one expected. He removed his badge and set it atop the forged ledger. A murmur moved through the crowd. "I failed my duty," he said, voice rough as dry timber. "I saw the numbers. Were wrong and let fear keep me quiet." The confession struck harder than accusation. For the first time, the town's guilt had a face willing to name itself. Silas Crow laughed, but the sound had no force left. "You would hand law over to writers and old stories?" he asked. Elias answered before Dakota could speak. "No. Law was handed over when truth was sold." The words settled like iron. Then from the rear of the gathered riders, a woman elder stepped forward wrapped in dark woven cloth, carrying a carved cedar staff polished by years of touch. Even Dakota bowed his head slightly. Her eyes rested on Elias, then on Silas, then on the townspeople. "Judgment," she said softly, "is not who suffers, it is what is restored." Many heard only the calm in her voice. Elias heard the warning inside it. She planted the staff in the ground beside the ledger. A circle widened around it. The tribunal was shifting from grievance to reckoning. Then came a new turn none had foreseen. The blacksmith Jonah Pike, who once took loans from Silas, stepped forward holding folded receipts from his apron pocket. "Mine were altered too," he said. Then the grocer added his own papers. Then a widow brought a mortgage note her husband died trying to pay. One by one, private shames walked into daylight. What had begun as one burned barn was becoming exposure of a whole quiet system. Silas looked around and saw men who once toasted him now standing apart. His boots seemed rooted to the porch boards. Yet Dakota still gave no ruling. Instead he turned west where dusk had begun washing the mesa purple and said, "Before nightfall, the man accused may answer." All eyes moved to Silas. Pride fought fear in his face. At last he said the debt was business, nothing more. That frontier life was won by harder men. Then old Mrs. Pritchard, frail as dry willow, stepped from the crowd and said, "No, it is won by decent ones." No one breathed. Even the horses stood still. A hawk circled overhead against fading light. Dakota lifted the red leather arrow Elias had once kept through fire and held it toward the town. "This token was given when mercy was chosen over suspicion," he said. "Can this town choose the same?" The question was not for Silas alone. It hung over every witness. Elias felt then this judgment might turn not on punishment, but on whether Bitter Creek deserved forgiveness. As twilight deepened and lanterns were lit along porches, no verdict had come. Yet tension sharpened because everyone sensed dawn would bring something irreversible. And beyond the last houses, more riders were appearing against the darkening flats, not arriving for war, but for whatever decision the morning would demand. Morning came colder than expected, a dry wind sweeping down from Red Mesa and carrying dust through Bitter Creek like a warning whispered across the plain. No one had slept much. Lamps burned late in windows, and before sunrise townsfolk were already gathering near the cottonwoods where the cedar staff still stood planted beside the ledger. But something had changed in the night. The 500 riders were no longer alone. Beyond them, stretching west in scattered lines against the pale horizon, more Comanche families had arrived with elders, traders, women carrying woven blankets, boys leading spare ponies. It looked less like an army than a nation bearing witness. That unsettled the town even more. They had expected force. They were seeing civilization. Dakota Red Hawk rode forward at dawn and dismounted beside Elias Boone. Neither man spoke for a long while. The silence itself seemed part of the proceeding. Then Sheriff Wallace, now without badge, called for the records to be read aloud. One by one the false debts were named. Jonah Pike's forged interest, Widow Mercer's stolen acreage, the grocer's altered grain contract. With every reading, Silas Crow's shoulders drew tighter, though pride still kept his chin raised. Yet it was not accusation that broke the morning open. It was a child. A small Comanche boy, no older than 10, stepped from the riders and carried a rough-hewn wooden plank blackened at the edges. He set it at Elias's feet. It was a salvaged board from the burned barn, found in the ashes before dawn by men who had ridden out quietly in the dark. Across the charred wood someone had carved one word: restore. A murmur rose through town. Even Mrs. Pritchard pressed a hand to her mouth. Dakota looked at Silas and said, "The frontier remembers what men destroy. It also remembers what men rebuild." For the first time Silas had no quick answer. The old woman elder stepped beside the cedar staff and lifted her palm. "Today," she said, "judgment turns." Then she surprised everyone. She asked Elias Boone, the wronged man, to speak first. Not the accused. Not the chief. Elias stared at the plank, then at the people who once watched his loss in silence. "I came here with 2 horses and a borrowed saddle," he said. "Built a life board by board. I thought fire ended it. But I was wrong." He turned toward Silas. "What burned was not a barn. It was trust." The words settled deeper than any threat. Dakota nodded, then called for the final measure. Silas Crow was offered a choice before witness: deny the fraud and stand apart from town and tribe alike, or restore every acre, every debt, every loss proved before the ledger. No prison, no rope, only obligation. The town held its breath. Silas looked from the riders to the citizens who had begun stepping away from him, and perhaps for the first time he understood power had deserted him in silence. His voice came low. "How much restoration?" Dakota answered, "Begin with the barn." Elias looked up sharply, sensing something more hidden in those words. And there it was. From the far side of the creek, 20 wagons rolled into view loaded with fresh-cut pine, iron nails, cedar beams, and tools. The 500 had not come merely to judge. They had come prepared to rebuild. A legend was turning before the town's eyes. Yet even then the deepest reckoning had not arrived. For as men stared at the timber and women whispered in disbelief, Dakota leaned toward Elias and said, "There is still one debt older than this town has not heard." And with those words, a larger secret began to rise with the sun. The wagons stood lined beside the creek through mid-morning, pine beams glowing gold in the sun, and men who once watched Elias Boone lose everything now stared at timber enough to raise not one barn but half a settlement. Yet Dakota's words lingered heavier than the lumber. "One debt older than this town has not heard." Elias felt them settle in his chest like an old memory knocking from behind a locked door. The old woman elder motioned toward the cedar staff, and the gathered circle tightened once more. Then Dakota reached beneath his saddle blanket and withdrew a folded oilcloth packet bound with rawhide. He handed it to Elias with both hands, not as gift but as return. Inside was a letter browned with years, the script delicate and unfamiliar. Sheriff Wallace leaned closer to read. It was written by Elias's father, Samuel Boone, a name few in Bitter Creek had heard spoken. Long before the town existed, Samuel Boone had guided a starving Comanche band through winter blizzards to a hidden spring near Red Mesa. He had taken no payment. He had only asked that if ever his blood stood alone in hardship, remembrance might ride for him. Elias stared as if seeing his own name for the first time. His father had died when Elias was 12. No one had told him this story. He had thought the river rescue began the bond. It had only renewed one far older. Dakota said quietly, "When you saved a boy in floodwater, you honored your father without knowing." Even old Mrs. Pritchard sat down on a crate, overcome by the weight of coincidence too perfect to be accident. But Silas Crow, cornered by truth and witness, made one final stand. He asked what right old promises held over deeds stamped by county seals. Dakota did not answer. Elias did. The kind of right a man keeps when no court is watching. The line moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. Then came the moment none expected. Dakota turned to Silas and said the tribunal had one final judgment beyond restoration. Silas stiffened, expecting ruin. Instead, Dakota pointed toward the wagons of pine. "You will build beside the men you wronged." Murmurs rose. Some almost laughed from disbelief. But the old woman elder lifted her staff. "Hands that took apart shall help mend." Mercy had arrived wearing obligation. Sheriff Wallace nodded first. Jonah Pike next. Even the grocer stepped toward the lumber. One by one men moved not as ordered labor but as neighbors returning to themselves. Silas stood alone for a long while, jaw set hard enough to crack stone. Then slowly, under the eyes of those he once bent through debt, he removed his fine coat, laid it over a fence rail, and walked to the first wagon. No apology, no grand confession, only a man lifting timber with both hands. Elias watched, almost unable to trust what he saw. Dakota stepped beside him. "This is harder than punishment," he said. "To rebuild before those you shamed." Elias gave the faintest nod. In the noonlight, hammers soon began sounding over Bitter Creek, not frantic but steady, like a heartbeat returning. Comanche riders passed nails. Town boys carried water pails. Women spread bread on blankets beneath cottonwoods. What had ridden in as judgment was turning into covenant. Yet while the frame of a new barn rose board by board, Elias unfolded the old letter again and found one final line nearly faded away. "If ever my son stands among men who choose greed over honor, tell him the land remembers who fed it kindness." Elias looked west toward Red Mesa, and something in his face softened. But Dakota was studying the horizon with a different gravity. More riders were approaching from the south, not Comanche. And for the first time since dawn, a new uncertainty entered his eyes. The new riders came out of the southern shimmer near noon, 8 of them in dust-gray coats, carrying no rifles in hand, only the stiff posture of government men used to being obeyed. Hammers slowed across the half-built barn. Even the horses lifted their heads. Sheriff Wallace squinted into the sun and muttered, "Territorial Land Office." A ripple of unease passed through Bitter Creek. It seemed impossible that after mercy had begun taking shape in timber and sweat, another test would arrive. The lead rider dismounted before the cedar staff and introduced himself as Marshal Gideon Pierce, a federal land agent sent to confirm claims tied to Red Mesa water rights. Silas Crow went pale enough for Mrs. Pritchard to notice. There were secrets even greed had not shared. Pierce carried a leather folio thick with deeds and survey plats. He looked from the rising barn frame to the gathered Comanche tribunal and seemed unsure which law he had entered. "Who holds title to Boone acreage?" he asked. Before Silas could answer, Dakota stepped aside and let Elias speak. "I hold what was nearly stolen." Pierce studied the forged ledger, the witness receipts, the cedar staff planted like a second flag, and said quietly, "Then the matter may be larger than debt." He opened the folio. Inside was a territorial survey older than Bitter Creek itself, signed decades ago. A water corridor running beneath Boone land had been reserved by treaty use for settlers and Comanche both. Shared rights. Shared guardianship. The town stood stunned. Silas had not only tried to seize a ranch. He had tried to privatize treaty water belonging to many. Jonah Pike let out a long breath through his teeth. "Lord help us," he whispered. Yet what came next changed the story entirely. Pierce looked at Dakota, then Elias, and said the territory had long sought a lawful steward over that corridor, someone trusted by both sides. He reached into the folio and withdrew a writ naming provisional custodianship should consensus be reached. No one expected what happened then. Dakota Red Hawk took one step back, placed his palm over his heart, and before 500 riders in one astonished town, bowed his head toward Elias Boone. "My people name him Keeper of the Spring." Silence broke open wider than thunder. Elias looked almost stricken. "I am only a rancher." Dakota answered, "That is why." Even Marshal Pierce smiled faintly at that. Then the old woman elder lifted the cedar staff from the ground and held it out to Elias. Her hands did not tremble. A man tested by loss can be trusted with abundance. Elias hesitated, then took the staff. In that instant the crowd understood the riders had not come only to settle wrongs. They had come to reveal hidden identity. Not a ruined debtor, but a guardian no one saw. Silas Crow stood staring at the same man he once mocked as poor, now recognized by tribe and territory alike. His shoulders sagged in a way no accusation had achieved. Then he did something none expected. He walked to Elias before all witness and removed a silver watch chain from his vest, heirloom of his father, and placed it in Elias's palm. "For the barn," he said, voice raw. It was too small a repayment for what had been broken, yet in frontier measure surrendering pride often cost more than gold. The old woman elder nodded once. Restoration was becoming real. Afternoon light turned amber over hammer blows and cedar beams. Children laughed near the creek where fear had stood 2 days before. But as Elias held the staff and watched the spring writ flutter in the wind, he sensed custodianship was not reward but burden. Dakota leaned close and said, "Judgment ends today. Responsibility begins tomorrow." And with those words Elias understood the hardest part of justice was not winning it, but carrying what came after. By sunset the new barn stood waist-high, its cedar frame catching amber light while the smell of fresh-cut pine drifted over Bitter Creek like a promise remade. Men who once hid behind silence now worked shoulder to shoulder, passing beams, driving nails, lifting walls that seemed to rise not from lumber but from repentance. Yet Elias Boone could not shake the weight of the cedar staff in his hand. Felt heavier than wood. Felt like history. As evening cooled the dust, Marshal Gideon Pierce asked the town to gather one final time near the spring head beyond the Boone pasture, where treaty water surfaced clear among stones. Lanterns flickered along the trail. 500 riders moved there in solemn quiet, townsfolk following behind. It looked less like procession than pilgrimage. At the spring, the old woman elder knelt and touched water with her fingertips, then motioned Elias forward. "A keeper does not own what he guards," she said. "He serves what serves many." Elias nodded, though doubt crossed his face. He had survived hardship. Stewardship was another thing. Then the final turn came from the man no one expected. Silas Crow stepped into the lantern glow carrying a folded document. His old arrogance seemed worn away like paint in rain. He handed the paper to Marshal Pierce. It was a signed transfer surrendering his contested claims over the water corridor and adjoining pasture, restoring what he had manipulated and adding acreage from his own holdings into common trust. A hush swept the gathered crowd. Jonah Pike whispered, "He gave up land." But Elias saw something deeper. Silas was not losing property. He was abandoning the lie that property made a man powerful. Dakota Red Hawk looked at him long, then gave the faintest nod of respect. Not forgiveness spoken aloud, but something close. Still, one unfinished thread remained. Sheriff Wallace asked who would oversee this new common trust when tribe and town disagreed, because men always eventually disagree. Elias looked from settlers to riders, from treaty spring to half-built barn in the valley, and answered with a quiet no one expected. "Not one keeper." Faces turned. Even Dakota seemed curious. Elias lifted the cedar staff and planted it into the earth beside the spring. A council. He named Sheriff Wallace, Jonah Pike, Widow Mercer, and to the astonishment of all, Silas Crow, alongside 2 Comanche elders and Dakota himself. Shared burden. Shared answer. The idea moved through the crowd like dawn entering dark rooms. The old woman elder smiled for the first time. Now judgment has become wisdom. Then Dakota removed the red leather arrow Elias had carried through fire and slid it into a notch carved atop the cedar staff. Symbol joined symbol. Debt answered by covenant. Mrs. Pritchard began softly singing an old hymn she half remembered from childhood, and somehow no one found it strange when Comanche voices answered in low harmony of their own. The spring water shimmered silver beneath stars just appearing overhead. For a moment frontier divisions seemed thinner than dust. Later, as people drifted back toward town, Silas lingered beside Elias. "Why name me to the council?" he asked, almost unable to ask it. Elias looked toward the barn frame standing against moonrise. "Because a man who has seen what greed costs may guard against it better than a man who never faced temptation." Silas lowered his eyes. There are apologies too deep for speech. This was one. As night settled over Bitter Creek, Dakota stood beside Elias near the spring and said, "Tomorrow many riders return home." Elias asked, "And you?" Dakota looked west where stars gathered over Red Mesa. "Some bonds do not ride away." Yet in his tone there was a distance Elias noticed, a quiet preparing itself. For though justice had found mercy, the story had one final truth left to reveal before dawn. At dawn the riders began leaving in long quiet lines, not with spectacle, but with the solemn grace of something completed. Hooves moved through morning mist along the flats west of Bitter Creek, fading one row at a time into the red-gold horizon. No bugles, no farewell cries, only dust lifting and settling again. Elias Boone stood by the nearly finished barn with the cedar staff beside him, watching 500 shadows return to distance. What had arrived like judgment departed like memory. Yet Dakota Red Hawk did not mount with the others. He remained by the treaty spring while the old woman elder placed a woven cord around his wrist and whispered words Elias could not hear. There was sadness in the ritual but not sorrow. Something older. When the last riders vanished beyond Red Mesa, Dakota turned to Elias and handed him a folded map drawn in fading ink. It marked hidden springs, winter trails, old crossings Samuel Boone once traveled with Comanche scouts. "Your father left more than a promise," Dakota said. "He left a road." Elias traced the lines in silence. For the first time he understood the twist hidden beneath all these days. His barn had burned, yes, but the fire had exposed an inheritance no man in town knew he possessed. Not land, not money, a calling. By noon the final ridge beam was lifted into place. Silas Crow helped set it with Jonah Pike, their hands on the same timber. No one spoke of how impossible that would have seemed 4 days earlier. Sheriff Wallace, now plain Mr. Wallace again, rang the church bell himself when the barn roof stood complete. Its sound rolled over pasture and spring water alike. Mrs. Pritchard said later she had never heard a bell sound so much like forgiveness. Toward evening the council gathered once at the cedar staff. The spring ran clear at their feet. Marshal Pierce prepared to ride east, leaving the writ in Elias's keeping. Before he left he asked Dakota whether he would remain on the council. Dakota looked toward the mesa and smiled faintly. "My place was never the council," he said. "Only the bridge." Then came the final quiet revelation. He told Elias he had known for years where Boone land lay and what men like Silas intended. He had watched from distance, waiting to see whether Elias would answer wrong with bitterness or dignity. The riders had not come because a barn burned alone. They came because a man proved worthy of an old promise. Elias lowered his head as though absorbing a burden and blessing at once. At sunset Dakota mounted at last. Before riding west he took the silver watch chain Silas had given in repentance and hung it beside the red leather arrow on the cedar staff. Debt and humility, memory and mercy, both bound there together. "Leave them," he said, "so this town remembers what nearly was lost." Then he rode away without turning back. Elias watched until horse and rider became one dark mark against fire-colored sky. Years later, travelers passing Bitter Creek would stop beside a strong barn and a spring shared by town and tribe, and they would ask why a silver chain and old arrow hung from a weathered cedar post. Old Mrs. Pritchard would answer from her porch, "Because justice came here once without firing a shot." And some nights, when wind moved through the grass beyond Red Mesa, Elias thought he heard distant riders in it. Not ghosts, reminders. He would stand by the barn he helped rebuild with men once divided and understand the deepest judgment had never fallen on Silas Crow at all. It had fallen on a whole town, asking whether fear or honor would rule. They had chosen honor barely, and that made all the difference. Out there, where dust covers names and memory outlives law, people said 500 Comanche once rode for judgment. But the old ones knew better. They rode so mercy would have witnesses.